Dear students, ladies and gentlemen, and the whole team from Leiden University, welcome to the Archaeological Research Unit. This evening I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Bleda S for the first time in the Archaeological Research Unit, at least in the public lecture series, who has kindly accepted our invitation to come and present the latest results of his excavations at the site of Chlorakas Pallures. Bleda received his PhD in 2006 from the University of Leiden for his work on Neolithic Turkey, having been a member of the team excavating the well-known site of Çatalhöyük. His thesis was entitled Constructing Communities, Clustered Neighborhood Settlements of the Central Anatolian Neolithic, circa 8,500 to 5,500 BC. He continued to work on the Anatolian Neolithic, taking up the role of field director in the Barsin-Höyük excavations, a Neolithic site near Bursa, and went on to direct the Side Archaeological Project, a 3-year survey project in the Turkish Black Sea that aimed to document sites of the poorly known pre- and proto-historic period in the region. A product of this work is the book he published in 2010, all of his work on Anatolia, not just the latest project, which was entitled The Prehistory of Asia Minor from Complex Hunter-Gatherers to Early Urban Societies. This is one of many publications he has brought out at a constant pace already since he was a graduate student. Bleda is currently an associate professor in Near Eastern archaeology at the University of Leiden, and he is engaged in diverse research projects across the Near Eastern region, the most important of which is undoubtedly the highly prestigious ERC Starting Grant project, for which he is investigating the archaeology of Middle Assyrian imperialism with a team of 6 researchers and focusing on the rich dataset of Tel Sabi Abiyat in Syria. The main of the project is to better understand what repertoires of rule made the Assyrians successful and how this impacted on peripheral societies and landscapes. Bleda is also directing a long-term landscape archaeology in the Wadi al-Jizi near the city of Sohar in Oman. The main of that project is to better explain the boom and bust phases in the past occupation of this marginal environment and how it was impacted by agricultural innovations, international trade, and climatological developments. The third field project he is currently directing is the one, of course, closest to our heart. This is the excavation of the Chalcolithic site of Chlorakas Pallures, which he started in 2015. The aim of this project is to better understand the emergence of complex societies and the rise of craft specialization and trade networks on the island, and there are already exciting new finds from the first 3 seasons of the projects, which he will share with us this evening. And as I have just told him, one of the benefits of having an excavation in Cyprus for us is that he's bringing a whole team from Leiden, and that hopefully some of the students and researchers will stay in Cyprus and continue on for their own research. And of course, this is a project with strong collaborations with the University of Cyprus. Our own Hari Paraskeva is an integral part of the project, and Andreas Haralamus and I have also collaborated on the study of some of the material, and we're very much looking to hearing about the site in more detail. The title of his lecture is The Excavations at the Site of Chlorakas Pallures, New Light on the Late Chalcolithic of Cyprus. Bleda.
Thank you for this flattering introduction. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to report on the Leiden excavations at Chlorakas Pallures between 2015 and 2017. And I'm going to focus mainly on the late Chalcolithic deposits that we have been excavating over these past seasons. We are reaching Middle Chalcolithic deposits in various trenches, but the main things that we have been uncovering over the past few years is late Chalcolithic. We have good evidence for the early late Chalcolithic, so between about 2900 and 2700, and the transition into the Middle Chalcolithic, and both of these are not very well known at present from other sites that have been investigated. And I also think the site has started to change our understanding of the late Chalcolithic period. We have new evidence for monumentality that I'm going to present today, and we have new evidence for metal artifacts that was already alluded to just now. Earlier this year, there have been excellent talks on the Chalcolithic in this series by Diane Bolger and our own Harry Paraskeva on how Chalcolithic communities were increasingly connected to the broader Mediterranean world. So I'm not going to talk so much about the connectivity issue today, although it's a very interesting topic. I think they did a better job than I possibly could. But I'm going to focus on the settlement at Palures and how it fits into our understanding of how the settlements interacted and how they differed from each other. So, of course, I present here on behalf of my team. So I'm talking, but it's really a team effort. I've been blessed with a great team of students and colleagues. Especially important for the project are people like Victor Klinkenberg, my field director, and Harry Paraskeva, my ceramic specialist, and Alan Suter, my groundstone specialist, and Lily Graham-Stewart, who is doing the lithics for us, Paul Croft for the faunal analysis, and Michelle Gamble, who's just started the human remains analysis. And I'm going to draw a lot on their work in this presentation. Before I really start, I want to express my gratitude to Eddie Peltenberg, who is really at the start of this project has been very important. So the excavation actually developed out of an email exchange with the late Eddie Peltenberg. This is some excerpt, there was in an email in November 2013 when he suggested that this site might be an interesting object for investigation. I was working at the time in Syria. Obviously, it wasn't possible to continue there. I was looking for new opportunities. And here was a middle and late Chalcolithic site endangered by development. And so I came over to visit, and I came over to talk to some people here in the department. And in many ways, Eddie had already done the groundwork. So basically, it was a question like, when can you start? So I'm really greatly indebted to Eddie for helping me in this way. And also for putting me in touch with some of the key people, for example, Harry, who was joined from the very start. The owners of the plot that we were going to work on were not very keen for us to start investigations. And so the government of Cyprus started an expropriation procedure for a period of 3 years, and we couldn't really start before the summer of 2015. So that's when we had the first season. So Kolorakos Palures is located in the Ktima region of the Paphos district. It is, of course, in an area which is being heavily developed today for tourism, and our site and many other sites are endangered by that development. It is one of a series of Chalcolithic sites situated quite close to each other, so they are about 1.5 kilometers apart, and we tested it one of these days, and it was 20 minutes walk to get from one to the next. Of course, these sites have been systematically investigated by the Lemba Archaeological Project from 1976 onwards. So the sites of Lemba Lakus and Kisonega Mosfilia and Kisonega Milutkia have been investigated. There is also Chalcolithic, of course, at Scalia. And so we know already quite a lot. So one might maybe ask, why excavate yet another Chalcolithic site in this small region? I will argue it today that all these sites differ in their size, in their complexity, in what is happening in them in terms of craft activity, for example, and how they are connected to broader exchange networks. So there is still a lot to be learned. This is what the site looked like during a second visit in 2014, in May 2014. And as you can see, basically they were already preparing the plot for construction. When I asked about it, they said, well, there were snakes on the plot and we wanted to get rid of them. So we notified the authorities from the municipality and from the Paphos Museum, and they were very effective and brought development to a halt. There was relatively little damage due to this activity. Most of the damage had already been done earlier, so we were lucky that way. The site was first recognized in the Paphos district survey in the 1950s. It was very systematically investigated by the Western Cyprus Survey of the Lemba Archaeological Project, who produced this map of the site. It's estimated to have been about 5 hectares in size. And since the 1950s, it has been heavily affected by a range of processes, first agricultural, so there is terracing going on, there is land consolidation, banana cultivation, and subsequently much of the site has been built up and cut up by roads. And here's the build-up area of the site at present. So a lot has already been lost. Our excavations over these past 3 years have been focusing on this plot 568, which was up for development. In 2017, the Paphos Museum, Margarita Kouali and her team also did rescue excavations in an adjacent plot at 355, and they also established that there's a lot of archaeology, good, well-preserved archaeology in that plot. So, what did we know before we started? It had been surveyed, of course, by the Western Cyprus Survey, and 12,000 sherds had been collected from the surface, which mainly dated to the Middle and the Late Chalcolithic. It's a tiny amount of early Chalcolithic, and we found one late Neolithic stone vessel fragment. That's it. Typical finds included Middle Chalcolithic clay figurine objects and a perforated discs that you see on this screen, probably used as net weights. The most systematic publication on the site, or most detailed publication, is in this survey volume edited by Maria Iacovu, where there's quite a bit of information about Palures. It was then known as Frisudia. And the site stands out in various respects among Chalcolithic sites in Western Cyprus. It is one of the largest known sites, as you can see on this graph. It has a relatively small amount of painted pottery in the Middle Chalcolithic. So that's similar to Lemba Lacus in that respect. But in the Late Chalcolithic, it has a relatively high proportion of red and black stroke burnished ware. So that's a bit more like Mosphilia. It seems to go up in the sort of quality of comparison with other sites. There's no filia pottery at all in the survey, and also we haven't found any in the excavations. The site also has a relatively high amount of Moni chert. And in this respect, it's similar to Suskiu Laona, where they also have a lot of Moni chert. Suskiu is, of course, next to the source of that type of chert. But in other sites in the Lemba area, the Moni chert is much less abundant. And this link to Suskiu is also visible in some of the other things that we have been finding over the past few years in Palures. So there are some differences between these different sites, also already on the basis of the surface evidence. And one of the things that we are interested in is, are these actual differences between contemporary sites, or is it partly something to do with chronology, which could be another explanation. Now, of course, there is very, very good research already been done in our area, over 4 decades of systematic research by the Lemba Archaeological Projects. There is a series of excellent publications. There are 2 archaeological parks with reconstructed roundhouses that can be visited for the general public. There's a great collection in the museums of Paphos and Nicosia that can be visited. So, yeah, you could ask, what could we possibly add to that achievement, the scholarly achievement of the Lemba Archaeological Project? I think the idea could be that we already know enough about the Chalcolithic in this area. But I think that's only really the case if we assume that all these settlements are alike. They're all interchangeable, and I don't think that's the case. There are clearly cases in prehistory where this might be true, and it has been argued, for example, for the Thessalian Neolithic by Catherine Perles, where she argues that there are a lot of small villages and they're all similar. But there's a problem with how we tend to think of villages. Villages as predominantly small agricultural places or fishing places that are undifferentiated and that rely on urban settlements for a series of facilities. But what's happening before cities come into being? I think we are talking about a very different type of settlements. In pre-urban settlement systems, there would have been more affluent communities, engaging more in monumentality. Craft activities would have been taking place in these settlements, and they would have engaged in all kinds of exchange networks. So this is closer to what people like Graham Phillip and Meredith Chesson were calling corporate communities. About a decade ago, they wrote about this concept. It's since fallen out of fashion somehow. More recently, Barbara Horec, working on Western Anatolia, has also written about this issue. She talks about proto-urbanization, which I think is a very poor term. It doesn't really do much for us. But the trends that she maps out for the Chalcolithic are, I think, significant. So she sees the emergence of differentiation between settlements, some specializing in craft activities, developing exchange networks, whereas others remain predominantly small farming or fishing communities. So there is all kinds of things that are going on, and not every settlement can be exchanged for another. And I think this model might actually work very well for Chalcolithic Cyprus as well. Okay, now this is the sort of intro why I think it needs to be done. And now I'm going to shift to actually talking about what we have been doing over the past few years and what we have been discovering. So the starting point for research was the road cut. There's a very long road cut, about 100 meters long. And we started cleaning that and documenting the various strata that were visible. There are a number of pits, and there were a number of possible wall features. It wasn't easy because we were talking about round houses that are eroding out of the section. So sometimes you think you see a wall and it's not really there, and sometimes we miss walls as we were excavating. But we placed some of our trenches over where we thought there might be walls in that section. We also did geophysical research. So we did two kinds of geophysical research. One of them is ground-penetrating radar. We had Til Solomon and Martijn Warnaar doing that. And as you can see, the results aren't really that clear. It's unfortunate, but the ground is being very much disturbed. There's a lot of building debris. It's very rocky, and so it's very difficult to get good results with this type of research in those kinds of conditions in very urbanized, disturbed environments. We also had John Hunt do electrical resistivity work on the site. And again, the results weren't really revealing that much. But I think the subsequent excavation work that we did, the Leiden excavations, but also the museum excavations, have clearly shown that negative results in geophysical research are not an indication for the absence of archaeology. So I think that's an important cautionary message. So sometimes you need to excavate. And in our case, there was a lot of pressure, of course. There was a 3-year time window. We needed to come up with good results, and then the department, on the basis of those results, could decide whether or not this site was important enough for additional measures for protection. So the emphasis in our project has been very much on speed. Sometimes we were not entirely comfortable with that, but we really needed to work fast. And so in these past 3 excavation seasons, we have opened 15 trenches of 5 by 10. So it's about 750 square meters, so it's quite a sizable area. As you can see, most of the trenches are in the south and west of the plot, along the edge of where the road is. And that's mainly because we did some trials in the upper area as well. But as you can see, the area up here, we have an indication here in green is basically bedrock area. So as you excavate the topsoil, you immediately hit the bedrock. It's not to say that there wasn't archaeology. I think most of the archaeology that was there has already been bulldozed away by past terracing activities. So the preservation is very much along the edge of the road. And here you see what that looks like. So some of the trenches that we put in the higher part of the plot is you take off the topsoil and you immediately hit the bedrock. And this is kind of the edge of that bedrock. And so from that moment on, we started really deciding that we needed to focus on the area where we have archaeological strata preserved. And the other thing about this site is that it's actually quite a steep site. So it means that the preservation of these buildings is usually not complete, and you will typically find half of a building, the upslope half of the building, whereas the lower half has disappeared due to erosion or these types of activities. So in that respect, it's very similar to a place like Suskiu-Laona, which is of course much steeper still, but we get the same kind of pattern that you see, often only half the building preserved. The other thing is that about this is there is a level of disturbance in that site, and it sort of biases your understanding. So on the basis of the survey evidence, or the survey evidence, and also our initial assessments of the pottery, it seemed like we had a rather substantial Middle Chalcolithic presence on that plot. And this is an overview that Harry produced a while ago. Now he has much more data. But in pink, you see the Middle Chalcolithic pottery, and then in sort of bluish green, you see the late Chalcolithic. And you see that in all the trenches, we have quite a lot of Middle Chalcolithic pottery. But actually, as we sort of progressed in the research, we realized that almost all that Middle Chalcolithic pottery that we have is coming from the topsoil and the unit directly below it. So it's probably stuff that has been bulldozed from other parts of the site. As we were excavating down, we were predominantly excavating late Chalcolithic deposits, and now again we are reaching Middle Chalcolithic at the bottom of some of the trenches. So yeah, there's no direct correlation in this instance between what you see on the surface and what lies beneath. So about that chronology, at present we have 5 radiocarbon dates, 2 from the northern area of the site in building 1, which are to be dated approximately between 2800 and 2700 BC. And then from the southern trenches we have dates, one date around 2600 from a chart seat, so that's a fairly good date. And then we have also transitional dates between about 3000 and 2900 BC from BU 13. So transitional between the middle and the late Chalcolithic, that is. So that's what we have in terms of radiocarbon dates. I'm also going to show you pottery later on, and you can assess that. And we're also using that, of course, as an important dating tool. So basically, this is the situation as it currently stands in terms of results from the excavation trenches. We have a northern area and a southern area. The northern area has relatively fewer structures, but they are very large and monumental structures, in part at least. And the southern area has smaller, less well-built structures, between about 4 and 8 meters in diameter, but there are a great many of them, and there are complex stratigraphic sequences in the southern area. So I will proceed to discuss some of those trenches and some of that data. First the northern area and then the southern trenches. Of course, I cannot present everything, so there will be a selection of things that I think are most interesting for you. So this is the season, the trench we were most excited about in the first season, which is BP10, and it was full of features. We had a building 3, which is in green, which is about 10 meters in diameter. It was only partially preserved because it's going into the road. There was another very large wall on top of it of building 2 here in yellow, which we don't really know whether it's a roundhouse or not. If it's a roundhouse, it's enormous. It would have been 17 meters or so in diameter. I'm not quite sure because it's just a short section of it. We had a hard feature that we couldn't really link up with any building here in red, and then there was a nice plaster floor in blue at the top of the trench, and again we couldn't really link it to any building. So we had a lot of interesting structures and features, but we couldn't really make sense of it. Luckily, that more or less fell in place in the next year. So the hard feature is actually part of a relatively small structure here in blue, which is about 6 meters in diameter, and we have quite ephemeral remains here of a cut in the bedrock, and we have this bit of wall. We have some floor that goes with it, and we're fairly certain, but it was not well preserved. And then the plaster floor is actually in front of an entrance of a very big monumental structure. Here's the entrance, and it was kind of a portico plaster area, and there are examples from places like Mosfilia for similar arrangements. So we were quite happy to solve these kinds of problems. And this has been by far the most spectacular or monumental building we have been excavating at Palures. This is our building 1. It's very well built. The walls are about 1 meter wide. The masonry is excellent. It has a nice threshold preserved, sloping down. There's the plastered surface outside of it. The plaster is partly going over the threshold. Then we have a plastered area in the entire south of the building, which is very nice. It's not preserved to the north, but almost the entire southern area is plastered. And we have all kinds of very interesting features in it. Among them, there's this very big hard platform, which is about 2.5 meters in diameter. It's outrageously large. I don't know of any other hard platform in the Chalcolithic that is that large. There is a sequence of fireballs. This is the older one. This is the more recent one in that hard platform. And then there were some large diabase slabs. There's one over here, and there was another one over here that we took out, lying on that surface. We don't really know what they are or what function they served. And then we have this very large double dip mortar installation. It's over 1 meter in size, and we don't really know what it is. There was a similar type double dip mortar in the Pitos building in Mosfilia, and it was interpreted by Eddie Peltenberg as a something to do with olive crushing. So that's certainly one possibility. And we would be very happy with that interpretation, but we must be cautious because we haven't found a single olive stone in our excavations, and I would expect them to show up. And we have excavated actually a lot of midden deposits in the site. So whatever the interpretation of that mortar installation, it is a very monumental and special building, I would say. At first, we thought, well, it's one of the sort of very big Middle Chalcolithic buildings, and it's similar in size to some of the buildings that we know from Mosfilia. But our dates very clearly show that it's actually late Chalcolithic, and you can see the late Chalcolithic evidence that we have. Buildings are actually much smaller than this one, so that makes it even more exceptional. because there's presently no other late Chalcolithic buildings that are this large. So we are quite confident about the dating of this building. We have two types of dating. One of them is there's a series of very large pit features in this under the floor of that building. So the floor actually goes over the pits, and the heart actually goes over the pits. So there's a very clear direct stratigraphic relationship between the pits and the building. And it looks like we had some pits that were used for quarrying the rock, for producing the floors. And then when they decided they wanted to do something here with this area and build a large house, they very quickly filled it up. And there's very large stones inside these pits. And of course a lot of soil. And in between that soil is also pottery. And this is the assessment that Harry produced, and you can see that a substantial amount of the pottery in those pits is late Chalcolithic. So by extension, the building must be also late Chalcolithic, or later, of course. So that's a relative dating. And then from one of the pits, we took 2 radiocarbon dates, which I already showed you before, which probably suggest a date of around 2800, 2700. BC. So the earlier part of the late Chalcolithic is probably where we need to date this structure. Okay, now I'm going to take you to the southern trenches of the site, where we have a larger number of structures. They are, as I said before, less well built, less monumental. There's a series of complex sequences, and we have quite a variability in construction technologies, which is also, I think, very interesting. So I will present some examples here today, but just to give you an idea of what kind of data we are getting from that area. So this is one of the more interesting trenches from an archaeological point of view, because there's a lot of sequencing to be figured out. So we have one building over here. We're not quite sure actually whether that piece of floor, there's no direct relationship between the floor and the wall. There's only a partial preservation. We don't know whether this building was actually round or maybe rectangular. The shape is not quite clear. Then we have another building over here, which would have been a round house. We don't know the relationship between these two, but we do know that both were at some point cut by this structure, which incorporates pieces of the wall of the 2 earlier structures. And then apparently these bits of walls were taken out and maybe reused to some degree in the new building. And then finally we have another structure in the corner. It has a very nice heart feature. So a nice plastered heart. We have a surface, not a good floor around it. And then there's a cut that cuts through this wall. And we can see it in this section, and we can see it also in the other section. So there is a building of sorts with a surface and a heart, but there's no clear outer stone wall that we sort of come to expect after excavating a few of these Chalcolithic structures. This is not completely unique. There are cases in Mosfilia as well, and in Lemba, where the outer wall is sometimes built of mud and not always well preserved. And we are assuming that this is a similar kind of situation where there was maybe a mud outer wall that's not well preserved because it's very close to the surface. There is also a series of burials in the bedrock next to it that we can't really tie clearly yet to this sequence of buildings, but we are working on that. This is another trench nearby, BW14, where at some point we hit a series of nice plaster floors, one on top of the other. So this is not one floor, but there's a series of them. But again, we were not able to sort of find any walls that did the sort of at the edge of it. So in the profile, we did see a clear cut, and so this is some kind of sunken structure with a nice plaster floor. But in the cut, we couldn't see any walling, so we are kind of assuming that the wall started at a somewhat higher level and then it has been eroded away or plowed away or something like that. Or maybe we need to look again, and maybe there is something after all. And yet another example to show you the sort of building variability is this stone structure that we dug at the end of last year. So this is in BU12, and you see the structure here. It's quite deep, quite far down, and it's remarkable because it's very high. So it's about 1.20 m standing, which is by far the highest calcolitic wall that I know of. I think the next one is 70 centimeters high. And generally it's thought that we are dealing with stone foundations, and the upper structure is in mud brick or loam or something like that. There have been some suggestions about buildings that were completely stone built, and this might have been one of them. The interior of the building was completely packed with stones. There were loads of stones that we took out, but not the exterior. So the collapse was all inside. And the wall itself is actually tilting like that. Now, I'm very interested to excavate the other side of this building in future seasons to see whether it's also tilting on that side. In that case, it could be a Tolos type construction where there's actually an arched roof, but it could also be that it's simply due to the pressure of the deposits that are above it. So that's something to investigate. This is the trench where we found the most interesting artifacts in the southern area. So we have a sequence of 2 buildings here. This is building 5, which is cut into the bedrock. It has a nice foundation cut. It's quite well built. It's about 8 meters in diameter. And there's a heart that's associated with it, at the floor level that goes under this one. At some point, at a somewhat higher level, they put another building in front of it. And they demolished some of the older wall, probably reused some of that older wall. It's much less well built. It's about 5.6 meters in diameter. And probably to be associated with this second building is this large jar that was lying on its side, and which had an amazing collection of artifacts. So I need to present it here today. So this is the jar as we excavated it. As we lifted it, and this is what it looks like after restoration, which just was done this season. So it's nearly complete. There's one sort of section of it missing where the plow has taken off part of the vessel. The best known parallel at present that we know of is in Calabasas Pambules. There's no this particular shape doesn't occur in our area. As we lifted the jar, we tried to block lift it, but it didn't work. The thing fell apart. We were in a hurry, of course. But that was good in a way, because out of the jar fell a lot of artifacts. Or as we sort of cleaned the soil inside it. So we have these hooks, which are made of probably fish hooks, made of boar tusks, which don't really have direct parallels that we know of. Maybe they're not hooks, but maybe they're for clothing or something. We don't really know. We had this stone axe, flat stone axe, which is has been argued before might be an imitation of metal axes in older publications, also by Eddie Peltenberg. And then we had this this metal axe lying against this stone axe. There was actually corrosion, metal corrosion on the stone axe. And this is quite spectacular because it's from a good late calculated context. We have a radiocarbon date from a carbonized seed from inside the jar, which is around 2600. And the next known metal axe that we know of is in the Filia, so that's several hundred years later. But this is by far the oldest known axe in Cyprus at the moment. It's now in the Paphos Museum if you want to go and see it. Andreas Charalambous and Lina Casinidou did the analysis of the metal artifacts, or the composition of the metal, here in Nicosia, and they established that there is a tiny amount of tin in the metal. It's not enough to call it a bronze, it's only 0.1, but it's too much for Cypriot ores, as far as I understand. So either the metal from which this artifact has been produced came from somewhere else, or the artifact itself was imported into the island. So that was a very nice find, the second season of the project. Of course, we have many other indications for contact outside the island, especially in the ceramic industries, and this is the kind of stuff that has already been argued for Mosphilia and Lemba-Lacus by Diane, and Harry is working on it for our side, but there are all kinds of rich decorations and spouts that suggest linkages with Anatolia already in the late Chalcolithic. And Harry is working on the fabrics, and he's seeing connections with Central Cyprus, and also, as I already said, with Calaphasos Pambulas there are some connections. So also within the island we're seeing evidence for connectivity. The lithics, after excavating a lot of them, analyzing a lot of them, it's also clear that this preponderance of moniture is actually real also in excavated assemblages. And so this similarity to Suskiu in terms of raw materials that we are using is actually something real and requires some form of explanation. So why do we have this material in these quantities, and why do the other Lemba sites not have it in the same way? So there's a differential connectivity to other places, it seems. And it's interesting that we also have some other connections with Suskiu in other materials. We have, apart from the metal axe, we have a few other metal artifacts from the site, and so we have things like the copper spiral, which is not as nice as the one from Suskiu Laona, but it's a similar type artifact. We have a copper snake, which is similar to the one at Suskiu Laona, not as nice. But we also have a snake on one of our figurative painted shirts, which Harry is very happy with. It's an amazing find. And again, you can see the similarity in the motif. And all of these are fairly unique finds. We know after all these years of the Lemba archaeological project that this is not a very common kind of thing. Not everything that we have is about connectivity in the broader outside world. We also have things that fit in the Lemba cluster much more comfortably, it seems, for now. So Alan Suter is looking at the groundstone assemblages, and we have some very spectacular things like this double dip mortar. But as I said, there are parallels at Mosphilia. We have this enormous pestle, which is quite spectacular, but it's not unique. But Ellen is working hard, and I think in a few years, or maybe 1 year, she'll be able to present some very exciting results. Paul Croft has been looking at our faunal economy, and this also fits very well with what we know from other sites in the area. I mean, you could basically almost date our site by looking at the faunal spectrum and the proportion of different types of animals, and it's very similar to Mosphilia, in particular the middle and the late Chalcolithic. The proportions are almost equal. So it's, they are doing the same kinds of animal husbandry practices, apparently. So very briefly about the burials as well. So they're mostly located upslope from the buildings. They like to cut into the bedrock just outside the buildings to the north and east, next to the actual structure. So here we have a whole series of them. We have one over here and one over there. But there are also some burials that are kind of in between buildings in sort of softer sediments, sometimes just in midden deposits. So they're not exclusively in the bedrock, and they're usually not in a very good state of preservation. We do have some capstones on top of them. That's also not always the case. They range from neonates to adults, but mostly children. And so far we have no fancy burial goods, unfortunately. So these are some of the burials that we have been excavating over the past few years. And Michelle has just come in the day before yesterday, and she's looking at the aging and the diseases and all kinds of aspects of these burials. So I can't say too much yet about those kinds of things. I also briefly want to say something about the figurines. There's often the idea that there's a marked decline in figurine use, production, and also picolite production. And we have only preliminary results. We have some figurines in calcanorite. We have quite a bit of picolite. We have some cruciforms and pendants. We have also some fairly unique things. This is a very large blank of something that would have been an enormous figurine if it was ever finished, but it broke somewhere in the process and it's in the cache. We have this quadruped with probably had an attached head, but it has no parallels. And then we have this thing here, which we have been calling the alien, because it's so different from anything we know from the Chalcolithic. We are very convinced that it's from a good Chalcolithic context. It has these eyes scratched in there, oval. It has an ear. It has a hairdo. And it's just much more figurative than the standard sort of geometric style of faces that we know of. But we are convinced that it's real, Chalcolithic. And so there's a story to be investigated about what's happening in the late Chalcolithic with picolite and figurines. And it's not just ending, it's transforming, I think. But we just have the tip of the iceberg for the moment. So, summarizing what we have after 3 seasons, we have good evidence for late Chalcolithic, early late Chalcolithic, and the transition between the middle and the late Chalcolithic, which in itself is important because it's a phase not very well known at the moment. We have new evidence for monumental buildings in the late Chalcolithic. We have new evidence for metal artifacts and trade. Which is, of course, something we already knew, but this contributes to that narrative. So increasing interregional connectivity. And there's this maybe issue that in the late Chalcolithic there is more figurine and picolite production and consumption than we so far thought. So I think these Chalcolithic sites are all different. They differ in size, in complexity, in what happens in them, in what kind of craft activities take place, and how they are connected with broader exchange networks. And we can only get to those kinds of differences by long-term investigations. And it's precisely the long-running research tradition in the Paphos area that enables us to see those kinds of differences. And it becomes a very rich picture. So we're not sort of replacing, we're contributing to the already existing scholarship of the Lamba Archaeological Project, and it provides a unique opportunity to understand the rise of social complexity in a pre-urban context, I think. So at the moment we're doing a study season, and there's good news about Pelurus. So the Department of Antiquities has decided to acquire both the plot of that we have been working in over the past 3 years and the plot that Margherita Coali has been testing out next to it, where she found good archaeology. So there's 2 parts of the site that are being acquired by the Republic of Cyprus and that will be safeguarded for the future, and we can continue our work in these plots. So they're currently being acquired. They're not yet public property, but they will be. And so we hope to continue our, transform our investigation into a long-term project. So from 2019 onwards, we hope to work from Leiden with local collaborations with also Cypriot students and do a long-term research project. So the future looks very bright, I would say, for this site at least. And yeah, I would like to thank all the people who have been working so hard for the project, but also, of course, the Department of Antiquities of Cyprus, the Bijvang Fund, who has financed us for the first 3 seasons, the late Edgar Peltenberg and Diane Bolger for all their support, Ian Cohn, and Paul Croft in the Edgar Peltenberg Archaeological Research Center at Lemba, and Leiden University, and Lina Kasianidou for inviting me here today, and you for your attention, and I hope you have lots of questions for me.
Thank you very much for this splendid lecture. Congratulations for the project, and thank you very much for sharing with us all this new evidence for a microregion that we suppose to know very well due to the research of the late Eddie Peltenberg, but we see that regarding the late Chalcolithic there is spectacular evidence, and I think that this will cause some questions from the audience, from specialists or less specialists. Who wants to start? Diane.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Bleda, for I've been looking at the site over the last few years in bits and pieces, but it was nice to see it coming together and how you're progressing with the interpretation. And also to say, on behalf of Eddie, who's not with us, but how pleased he would be to know that his work is being continued in this very systematic and thoroughgoing way, and especially by a Dutch team. And also, including Harry, Harry was Eddie's last PhD student, before he died. So it's a very special confluence of activities here. And anyway, that's just a personal remark. I did have a question, though, and that was, you mentioned BU13 and a radiocarbon date that is, 2900, and it's going to be kind of transitional. That area will be transitional from middle to late Chalco. I wondered whether you could tell me a little bit about the material that's coming out in association with that date, because one of the frustrating things, Cassandra produced so much, but one thing it didn't produce was much of an idea about the transition from the middle to the late Chalcolithic, because there's about a 200-year gap, as far as we know, between periods 3B and 4A at Cassandra. And as much as we tried doing trial soundings in various places, we could never actually find the link between the two periods. And I'm wondering whether yet, or is it too early, whether you're starting to get some evidence, whether it just be ceramic, architectural, or whatever, that is showing us a little bit of that transition.
Yeah, I think I'm not actually the best person to ask that question to. So I've asked Harry to look particularly at that trench and to look at all the ceramics, and he hasn't really told me yet what's happening. So maybe you could tell us now.
If it is too early, just give us a hint.
We can give a small comment. What we are seeing is a gradual transition, the selection of clays, the selection for the sources of the clays. We are seeing a gradual shift from the calcareous clays that we have in the middle Chalcolithic to more mixed clays and more igneous clays by the late Chalcolithic. And what we are starting to see, and what I've particularly focused in this study season, is the transition from the red monochromes of the middle Chalcolithic to the red monochromes of the late Chalcolithic, and particularly the red and black stroke burnished wares. So we're starting to see evidence that it's a more gradual transition rather than an abrupt beginning for a new type of a new ware. Because we're seeing examples of the intense burnishing without the clay recipe for the RBBs. And we're also seeing examples where you have inclusions like the nice chert, the crushed chert that they include in the RBBs, but not as well fired, and with surfaces that are exactly the same as the ones we have with the red monochromes of the middle Chalcolithic. So we are tracing things and hope to create a That's what we are trying to document.
Are there more questions? Yeah, Lindy.
Thank you, Bleda. That's really exciting. And I'm probably going to ask a question that needs to go to Harry as well. The jar that the axe and everything was found in is utterly amazing. And it really does seem alien to what we expect from late Calcolithic jars in the region. And the loop, those loop handles almost. I mean, are you feeling, or is Harry feeling, any possibilities of mainland connections stylistically?
No, yeah, so Harry has been looking for all the parallels, and he came up with a set of parallels at Pambulis, which look pretty convincing. We need to go and check those parallels and see whether the fabrics and things are also similar, but the shapes are similar, right, Harry? So I don't know if you want to add something to that, but that's where we are at the moment in terms of parallels.
Just red monochrome. You would just call it a red monochrome, but not the same as a Middle Chalcolithic red monochrome. It's a different kind of red monochrome. So it does have something that looks like.
If I may ask on this spot, as far as I can see on the picture, we don't have to do with any stroke burnished ware or something like that. It's homogeneously burnished, etc. What sounds to you to be an alien finds a home actually in the East Aegean and Western Anatolia, regarding both this very intensive red burnishing, and also regarding the shape. I don't know how big it is exactly. Yeah, okay. And at least at the Heraion of Samos, we have pithoi. So in this form, with very thick walls, almost 2 centimeters. And it's exactly the same type with a bit more strap handles.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, we are speaking about 120, 130 high pithoi, but in this. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Lina?
I want to go back to the contents and the hooks. They're quite large. Do we have evidence for fishing? Do you get any fish bones preserved or anything that would show that they were using such big...
So yeah, that is an issue indeed. So I must say at first that we did very little sieving, wet sieving or sieving, dry sieving. So we don't have a lot of fish bones at all. We have some crabs and things like that, but no real fish bones. They wouldn't usually preserve very well, but we need to start really doing that sieving to see whether there is fishing going on. The thing that I find particular about this is that after all these decades of excavations at Lemba and Mosfilia, how few fish hooks we really have. So maybe they're fishing in different ways, and maybe these are not fish hooks, but they are fasteners of some sort for clothing or a bag or whatever. And you could imagine, because there's a whole series of them and they're all identical, that they would sort of go well on some kind of bag or something like that, but it's not something that I can really. It's speculation, really. But certainly the fishing part, we need to really get into that and do some more systematic. Because, as I said, we were digging very fast. Now we can start doing things more slowly, and part of that will be more intensive sampling and sieving and all those kinds of things.
Similarly for the botanical remains.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't have much.
We have some botanical samples and we have some data. They're still being processed at the moment in Groningen, but it's we need more. and now we have the opportunity to actually do that. So, yeah.
Jenny Webb.
Thank you, Bleda. I think I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question of Andreas Haralambous. I want to ask him anyway, and Lena. Just referring to your axe, you mentioned that it has some tin in it, and that this ought to mean that it can't be made of Cypriot copper. Is it the case that the presence of any tin at all, even very, very small traces of tin, rules out the possibility that the object is made of Cypriot copper completely? Okay, that's interesting, Andreas.
So it's not, it's 0.3 or something like this. It's not that low to be that very. Cypriot ores are there's no tin at all. So. We have analyzed all the Chalcolithic artifacts from the Lemba project, and they will be published in the volume on Laona. And there's there's more. It's not a unicum. And also we have tin in the glaze of the faience beads of this period. And when this was detected already in the first analysis done by Tide and Shortland, and the first conclusion at that time was that the faience was intrusive, but the ones from Laona come from a very well excavated context, and there is tin in that glaze, so there's something happening there.
And Lemba is sort of now produced artifacts that have copper artifacts that have tin, so this is fitting nicely into the bigger picture. I think everyone heard me, but I'm just saying this is actually not an anomaly. It's fitting into the larger picture of the work that Lena and Andreas have done to show that now we're getting a number of artifacts and ornaments from this period that and also the faience is coming from the Middle Chalcolithic period, not the Late Chalcolithic. So we're getting evidence of bronze-based glaze already in the 4th millennium.
More questions? Yes.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to know a little bit about the spatial differentiation, specifically with the fauna. Are you seeing anything different in building 1 with the fauna from elsewhere in the site?
That's a good question. Something we need to investigate.
It would be really fascinating, right, if there's a different sort of foodway there.
Yeah, so as you all might know, Paul is currently in the UK undergoing medical treatment, has a second hip replacement recently. He's recovering, he's doing well, but he hasn't been able to look at our bones for some time, and we haven't been able to ask these kinds of questions to him. But yeah, it would be really interesting to see whether there's elite food, for example. Yeah.
If I may stay in building 1, which is, you have described it as a monumental one. You have mentioned that there is a plaster above it. Do you mean that after its abandonment it has been covered, this special monumental building, that it has been covered, let's say buried ceremonially or something like that?
And it doesn't look like it's an abandonment thing. I think it was simply a very nice building with a very big wall and a nice plastered floor. Of course, I can't really say whether it was covering the entire building. In the northern section of it, it's simply plowed away, eroded away, and so we don't have any preservation in that part of the building. But it looks like it's the original floor of that building, and that in itself is rare. I mean, usually in the Middle Chalcolithic you get very nice floors, but they're in a segment of the building, right? And then in the Late Chalcolithic you get less often you get these nice floors, but this seems to have been almost throughout the entire building, so that's also quite special, I say. But,
and another thing, if I may, in the southern area, you have shown us more buildings, And you said that remarkably they were using different building materials. Is there any indication of earthquakes that forced them to try building with different materials?
I wouldn't know, really. I mean, how can you, maybe if you have a building which has really shifted or something, we don't have that kind of evidence currently in the data set. So I don't know why they're doing things differently in different buildings. I don't really have an explanation yet. Sorry.
Yeah. And because the late Neolithic, also the middle Neolithic, they are very long periods, but of some 100 years. In particular, about the late Neolithic, I would like to ask you, Chalcolithic, sorry. Are you defining the, let's say, the subphases of the late Chalcolithic through different buildings or through more floors in one building? What is the case?
At the moment, I think the main thing that we're trying to do is work out stratigraphy of various buildings that are often constructed in the same area, working with the ceramic analysis, working with radiocarbon dates. I don't think these buildings necessarily were in use for a very long time. So I think that, and that's partly what we're looking at is that, if I can go back to that slide with all the different buildings, this one. So it's not like they're being continuously occupied, because then you would expect them to reuse the same building and renovate it. But they are sort of regularly coming back to the same area and building something new, which suggests that whatever was there before was either partly covered, already falling apart, and they felt the need to build something new. So that's something to really figure out, but my feeling is that it's 1 or 2 generations and then these buildings are done, and then you move somewhere else perhaps. So I don't think these buildings themselves are very long in duration.
Thank you. Are there more questions? If this is not the case, we thank you again very, very much, and we wish you all the best for the continuation, which will fortunately take place at that site. Congratulations.